Hi guys, and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. Ancestral Recall is a Magic web show that explores the depths of Magic the Gathering's past, set by set. We look at the mechanics, the cool cards, the weird cards, the standouts, and give some tips on what might spice up your cubes or casual decks. Today, we're looking at Alliances, the follow-up to Ice Age, the set that turned the Magic direction to a game that embraced risks, adopting the idea of powerful spells and lands and fresh creatures, moving away from 1994 and 1995's shrinking Violet sets that saw how powerfully broken ABU's spells were and were incredibly averse to printing spells that could dominate tournaments. Alliances knew that players wanted the thrill of power and had been denied that rush for quite a while. Alliances had cards that excited tournament players, doing things that no other cards had done to date, like having an alternate casting cost. Alliances was a crucial set in promoting the long-term viability of Magic. Sold in 12-card boosters with 8 commons, 3 uncommons, and an actual rare, Alliances was released in June of 1996. The set had 110 cards, and like Fallen Empires and Homelands, the set featured multiple arts for many commons and some uncommons. Story! Okay, this isn't going to be that crucial. Essentially, Planeswalker Freyalise removes the spell that was artificially keeping Dominaria frigid, and civilizations came back to reclaim their territory from the wastes. They allied together to beat back the Necromancer Limb Duel, and Dominaria's future seemed bright. The Phyrexians were still plotting in the background, though. 5 sentences on story. Done. Continuity really wasn't that crucial at the time. Speaking of flavor, Alliances is the last set to print commons with multiple artworks. Like Homelands, Alliance dialed this gimmick back from its highlight in Fallen Empires, choosing to have only 2 versions instead of 4. Also, this time most of these pairs were illustrated by the same artist, making their looks more unified. But players still had trouble identifying the commons, and so this approach fell by the wayside. Mechanics and cycles. Like previous small expansions such as The Dark, Fallen Empires, and Homelands, Alliances chose not to introduce any new keywords. And I'm going to speculate that the reason for this is that the rulebook for Magic was something that Wizards considered to be paramount to exist in paper that came with starter decks at the time, and digitally second. And so they didn't want to have new rules in new expansions at the time. The last time they added rules inserts to boosters, well, that was in Legends, and that didn't go over too well. Although, yes, Ice Age did have its own rulebook, which did explain Rampage and cumulative upkeep there. But Rampage got its own rules text in the Legends insert card as opposed to actually being on the cards. And for another thing, Legends also had bans with other. Worst mechanic ever. Now, keep in mind that in 1995, the internet was still in its relative infancy at the time of the set's release. Wizards has never said this in public, but given that the internet was still in its infancy, having the rule booklet be the heart of the rules did matter a ton, and making sure that everything is in the rulebook was a huge anchor on the game in terms of presenting new mechanics. Anchor in the sense of that's where it was centered, and when it's down, you can't really move much. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't new mechanics in Alliances. There's the famous, and I do mean famous, pitch cycle. Expensive instants that players can play for free if they exile a card from their hand of the matching color. And you know this cycle from its blue representative, Force of Will. Force of Will is an absolute essential in Vintage and Legacy and the original extended format for anyone running blue. And Force of Will is also arguably the most powerful counterspell ever printed. Many writers have called Force of Will a safety valve, keeping combo decks from running wild. Although my 2 favorite decks of all time are combo decks and use Force of Will to defend their combos. So Force gives as well as takes away. There are 4 other cards in the pitch cycle, and they're not that famous, but we'll still look at them. Scars of the Veteran, 4W, is a powerful damage prevention spell, giving a creature +1/+1 counters for each damage prevented. This effect is way better in smaller versions such as Test of Faith, but the fact that this can be played while tapped out is a rather sneaky way of pumping. Black's representative, Contagion, features a rather monstrous-looking cat. What exactly is the cat's connection to the bodies in the background? Ooh, I want to know. Contagion doles out 2 counters functionally equivalent to weakness, though you can put both counters on a single creature if you'd like. This is also the only card in the cycle that got a white border release thanks to the Finkel vs. Garfield Deckmasters box set. I like Contagion quite a lot. Pyrokinesis, 4RR, is a 6-mana burn spell that lets you divvy up 4 points of damage, though only to creatures. Sadly, the inability to target players kept this from tournament play. This was a variant on Legends Pyrotechnics. And as you might suspect, green's representative in this cycle was a pump spell, in this case, Bounty of the Hunt, 3GG. Bounty drops down 3+1/+1 counters, divvied up anywhere you want, although they go away at end of turn. While the wording saved space on the card and was quite clear, temporary +1/+1 counters are not something I'm a fan of. Still, Bounty of the Hunt was the first giant growth effect that didn't require mana to play. New Phyrexia's Mutagenic Growth and Mercadian Mask's Invigorate are the only 2 free pump spells that come to mind. This cycle is the first to feature alternate casting costs, a well that Magic has gone back to repeatedly. Since then, pitch spells have been used numerous times throughout Magic's history, from Mask's Block, most notably. Cold Snap, a throwback to Ice Age Alliances, even featured double pitch cards, letting you pitch 2 spells to get an extremely powerful free effect. Phyrexian Mana from New Phyrexia is another fun spin on alternate casting costs. Kicker is another mechanic that relies on alternate casting costs. And there are so many variants of Kicker that are actual keyword abilities. I mean, Oath of the Gatewatch's Surge mechanic, which is brand new as of the making of this video, that's a new alternate casting cost. Morningtide's Prowl, yeah, that's another. Let's just face it. Force of Will and alternate casting costs are a motherlode of design space, and the things that people will remember about Alliances. Another powerful cycle in Alliances is a rare cycle of lands that require you to sacrifice a land when they come into play. Some are terrible, like Balduvian Trading Post, which lets you deal a single point of damage, just to an attacking creature. Big deal. Heart of Yavimaya, while flavorful, only gives you the option of a small +1/+1 pump. Soldevi Excavations is considerably better, tapping for a colorless and a blue mana, and not making you actually lose mana per se, and you have the opportunity to scry for 1. Yes, scry is here. Well, it's not actually called scry. Lake of the Dead demands an untapped swamp you sacrifice to it, and continues to eat your other swamps by sacrificing them to add B to your pool. This powered out huge spells in black decks, and was a very interesting variant on Dark Ritual. The most played land of the cycle was Kjeldren Outpost, the first land to produce token creatures. The Outpost was quickly adopted by blue-white control decks. There are other cycles in Alliances, such as 3-color gold cards and the Color Hoser cycle, but they're not so relevant, and I'll get to those in the individual card section. Let's get to the rest of the set, and as usual, I'll go through in WUBRG order. Here's an example of a slow trip with a 2 conservative mana cost. Carrier Pigeons for 3W gets you a 1/1 flyer and a card on the next turn. Thematically, the idea of waiting for a message, coupled with a flyer, is a cool, flavorful execution. I get it, it just costs too damn much. White gets some prime removal in this set as alternatives to Swords to Plowshares, a removal spell that was iconic for white but that Wizards figured out was just undercosted. Exile, for 2W, gives you the life for exiling an attacking creature equal to the creature's toughness, but it can exile white creatures. Now, the color restriction on exile is particularly odd, since white creatures should be able to be affected by white setting down the law. Reprisal, for 1W, established the idea of white hating creatures that were too big for their britches, destroying a creature outright with power 4 or more. This inspired later cards like Intrepid Hero and Smite the Monstrous. Sustaining Spirit, for 1W, has a steep upkeep cost, but as long as this creature is in play, you won't die from damage. A variant on Arabian Nights' Ali from Cairo, Sustaining Spirit directly inspired Urza Saga's Worship, though its reliability was far worse thanks to its relatively fragile stats. I love the art on this card, but the cost and lack of resilience keeps me from playing it in my white EDH deck. Arcane Denial. 1U for an instance. So many slow trips here, but this one, it's appropriately costed. Now this is counterspell. The controller of the counterspell gets 2 slow trips, and you get a slow trip. Of course, if you respond to an enemy counterspell on a test spell by using Arcane Denial to counter this spell that you originally casted, then you get 3 slow trips. It's a sneaky little ploy. Now, there's a lot of board development that comes from Arcane Denial, and that's quite unusual. Dream Fracture from Eventide is a similar spell, except as per modern templating, there's no more waiting. Also, Arcane Denial has some sweet Richard Kane Ferguson art on these cards. I really love RKF. There have been numerous attempts to fix Power 9 cards throughout Magic's history. Days Undoing in Magic Origins is the latest reincarnation of ABU's Timetwister. Diminishing Returns is 2 UU and forces you to exile 10 cards from the top of your library, but this is still a spell that lets you draw 7, and there are quite a few casual archetypes that feed on that sort of thing. Stormcrow is printed here for the first time, and I have to put on my grumpy man act here. Get over it already. Now, I liked Stormcrow back when Stormcrow was called Hundrug. Hundrug was the first card everyone made jokes about, and then suddenly everyone migrated over to Stormcrow. This is the Magic equivalent of Pokemon fans going crazy over Lord Helix Ammonite, or however you say it. Maybe I'm just a humorless crank, but I just don't like jokes like these. I spent too many years in Japan, so my personal sarcasm tolerance just withered away. Also, get off my lawn. Hey, it's a Homerid! Viscerid Drone is the first Homerid printed since Fallen Empires, and, well, in Magic's history, there's only one more Homerid printed after this. But Viscerid Drone likes to kill things using swamps and creatures. This is the best example of alliances with allied colors teaming up in the set, at least not on a gold card. Feast or Famine for 3B is a powerful modal spell. It's either a terror or a gray ogre, whichever you need at the time. I had this in my early draft cubes, and it really felt miserable to cut it. It's definitely inefficient by modern standards, but Feast or Famine is one of the very first modal spells with an engaging choice. Most of the time, the removal mode is correct, but it's good to have a backup plan. Phyrexian Boon, 2B, is 3 mana and an incredibly flexible aura, either pumping a black creature of yours +2/+1, or giving a non-black creature -1/-2. Now, the mathematician in me wishes that this card were more symmetrical by replicating ABU's Unholy Strength and Weakness. But in terms of power, -1/-2 is usually better than -2/-1. Ritual of the Machine for 3B is quite flavorful. You sacrifice one of your creatures to steal an opponent's creature that would otherwise be eligible for terror. Now, Ritual of the Machine feels both fairly costed and fair without breaking the color pie. I like it. Balduvian Horde 2RR was the most hyped card on the set's release because of its stats. A 5/5 for 4 mana. Now, in 1995, this was immediately compared to Arabian Nights' Juzam Jin, the only other 5/5 printed for 4 at that point. And the costs of a single random discard seemed a lot more manageable than the constant pinging of the Juzam. With that said, the Horde turned out to be incredibly unwieldy and just too slow for red players' tastes. Part of the joy of Juzam Jin was that you could use it by running it out on turn 2 with the assistance of Dark Ritual or Soul Ring. Balduvian Horde never got the benefit of those accelerants to help it out. But oh man, when this card got previewed, people got excited. Ladies and gentlemen, I try not to complain about cards unless they warp formats. Skullclamp is a bad card, because it made Standard unfun until it got banned. Tolarian Academy enabling regular turn 1 kills in Standard makes it one of Magic's worst cards of all time. Well, I'm going to tell you, this card, Death Spark, is a bad card. It's both weak and bad. Now, why do I say that? Because Death Spark's existence relies on keeping graveyards in a specific order. Now, thanks to the existence of this card, you have to do a lot of clicking to put cards in Magic Online, in an order when you discard or mill multiple cards, though there is a shortcut to do it automatically. In Standard and Modern, you don't have problems with reorganizing your graveyard because there's no advantage to be gained by it. But for many years, maintaining your graveyard order was required in tournaments thanks to this card, and players who were lazy and didn't pay attention to this occasionally got game losses. And that is why I hate Deathspark. To be fair, there's another card in the set with the same mechanic, Kravickian Horror. Now, the timing on Kravickian Horror is a bit different, but it's more or less the same thing. I'm glad these cards are so weak because they're the source of no small amount of annoyance. Gorilla Shaman, for R, was an immediate hit with Type 1 players, or what today is called Vintage, because it was an incredibly powerful tool to fight Moxen, Sol Ring, and other mana accelerants all at once. This was a card printed to deal with a format that had rapidly gotten out of hand, though from contemporary analyses of Vintage, the environment was quite tame. Now, the fact that Gorilla Shaman can sneak itself out on turn 1 and void most counter magic is not coincidental. This card was also spawned out of the conflict that the designers had with management, where a decision that was very unpopular met a response with every single card name in the design file having a monkey or ape-themed name. There are tons and tons of gorillas in alliances, including a 7/7 for 7. King Kong, well, he stinks. There's even a stealth simian with Guerrilla Tactics, a red burn spell that saw some significant sideboard play against discard decks. The name is just totally inappropriate in terms of flavor, but hey, Guerrilla. I'm okay with puns, by the way. One of Magic's earliest legitimate archetypes was mono-red land disruption. Alliances featured a card that put that archetype into legitimate contention, Pillage, 1/RR for a sorcery. Pillage has the versatility of destroying artifacts as well as lands, which often made it far more effective in the day where mana rocks were far more plentiful. Note that Pillage is extremely playable at 3 mana, whereas Demolish has seen inclusion in countless sets in recent years and gets very little play. Varchild's War Riders, 1R, has a bizarre combination of abilities. Trample and Rampage 1 make this 3/4 a threat, but he has a cumulative upkeep of spitting out 1/1s on the other side of the table. What? Now, the War Riders will never mind all these tokens coming out, but if your opponent can manage to hold off the War Riders and send the survivors back, you're going to be in some deep crap. There are several combo approaches with this guy, most of them involving Lure, and yes, this can be a crazy card in Tiny Leaders. Deadly Insect for 4G isn't the first creature with Shroud, that would be Autumn Willow. But with 6/1 stats, this is exactly what you want in a shrouded creature against control decks. By today's standards, this is incredibly weak, but at the time, this was actually one of the most powerful green creatures and tournament playable. Dodging premier spot removal spells was crucial for green to win games, and Deadly Insect made a significant change in the metagame. Elvish Spirit Guide is another completely groundbreaking card. First off, it's 2G, but no one ever plays it. You can discard it for a single green mana one-shot, the green equivalent of Dark Ritual. Now, while Elvish Spirit Guide only nets you 1 mana, while Dark Ritual nets 2, Elvish Spirit Guide can't be countered except by Stifle effects. This makes it a necessary component of various decks like Belcher in Legacy and Vintage. And yes, there is a direct descendant, Simian Spirit Guide in Planar Chaos. Now, why is the descendant to this fairy an ape? Well, it's because the Simian Spirit Guide is a reference to Alliance's The Gorilla set. Green doesn't usually get creatures that pump up the rest of the team. That's a white thing, more or less. But in the case of Kai'Sa, 3GG, that isn't the case. Sadly, Kai'Sa didn't have the toughness to fight bolts in a format with many of them, and so she didn't see a lot of play. Yavimaya Ants for 2GG is the first hasty green creature and an interesting variant on the Dark's Ball Lightning. With that cumulative upkeep, the ants are definitely marked with planned obsolescence, but they were necessary components for many green decks at the time. Since then, we've had several references, such as Giant Solifuge, Groundbreaker, and Stranglegeist. Green is tertiary in haste, but that tertiary status had to start somewhere, and that's here. Lim-Dul's Vault is a fascinating variant on Demonic Tutor. And by that, I mean that for UB, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library, finding a card you like, and leaving it and 4 others on the top in any order. But if you don't like those top 5, you can pay life to put them on the bottom and look at the next 5 top cards. And you can keep paying life until you find the satisfactory 5 cards. This is much like Vision's Vampiric Tutor in that it doesn't actually draw you the card, but it lets you look at so many more cards. This was a component of early combo decks in Extended. Do you like to play politics in multiplayer? Do you love helping your friends as much as hurting your enemies? Then you want to play with Feldegriff. This card's name is an anagram in honor of Richard Garfield getting his doctorate, thus Garfield PhD becoming Feldegriff. And Feldegriff can fly, get bigger, and gain protection from its enemy colors, all while helping out a friend. There are 4 other 3 color cards in the set, but Feldegriff's easily the most memorable. Also, come on, Flying Purple Hippo? What the hell? Helm of Obedience costing 4 is what would happen if Millstone and Control Magic had a baby. Helm lets you mill an opponent's library for X until you hit a creature. At that point, you sacrifice it and put that creature into play under your control. This control effect cannot be disenchanted, although obviously bounce spells will return it to its owner's hand. But back in '96, lots of control players used creatureless builds, and Helm of Obedience was amazingly effective against them. Phyrexian Warbeast would be below the curve today, thanks to its drawbacks of being forced to sacrifice a land and take a point of damage if it leaves play. But by the standards of the time, this guy was huge for 3 mana, and it was a complete staple in Alice Block Constructed. Admittedly, Alice Block Constructed was a format that saw very little play despite WotC's coaxing. But it was the format for the Finkel vs. Garfield showdown. No discussion of alliances would be complete without mentioning one of the most powerful lands of all time, Thawing Glaciers. Thawing Glaciers comes into play tapped and can't even tap for mana, but it lets players search their library and fetch out a tapped basic land. Get out the Thawing Glaciers, and it's going to be really, really hard to miss a land drop. This is an ongoing source of card advantage for any deck, though aggro decks didn't really profit from it. This was so powerful that Thawing Glaciers got banned in Block Constructed. Thawing Glaciers has never been reprinted except as a Judge promo, and that's for good reason. Let's take a short pause to look at the 5 most valuable cards from alliances. Final verdict. Alliances had a lot of innovation. Without introducing new keywords, that's hard to pull off. There were some carryovers of bad mechanics, such as cumulative upkeep and rampage, and one card that actually had both and managed to be fun. But we got the first cards with alternate casting costs, that is to say, free. And it is hard to understate the importance of spells that transform the way we looked at mana. Some players got really upset at the idea of pitch spells, saying that they were breaking the mana system. I beg to differ. If you want to see something breaking the mana system, you don't have to look any further than the Moxen and the Soul Ring and the other mana artifacts of ABU. That Rubicon had already been crossed. Also, the pitch spells were defensive in nature, with the exception of Force of Will, which did allow threats to be defended, and kept games from getting out of hand. So if there was a 3/3 you could play as a pitch spell, I'd agree that yeah, this probably broke the mana system. Cold Snap's Allosaurus Riders tried that kind of thing and failed. The particulars of the pitch spells were fairly balanced. Another thing that Alliances did is have a host of powerful legendary lands that mattered without being inherently better than basic lands. This was a chance for Wizards to push the envelope, and many players cheered for Gjelderin Outpost since it gave decks with 20 counterspells a fit. Sacrificing another land was probably pushing the boundaries a bit too much, but at least Wizards was trying to push the boundaries instead of running away from boundaries in terror like so many previous sets. With that said, compared to more recent sets with fully fleshed out creative settings such as Khans of Tarkir or even Kamigawa, Alliances doesn't have a lot of development or originality. It's a stock European fantasy setting with only a modest theme of, ugh, it's cold. In Vorthosian terms, Alliances really isn't that special. We didn't get to see Limdul, only a few of his lackeys. That was a major disappointment, so I want to note that shortfall. Also, while Alliances helped improve Ice Age's limited potential, it wasn't enough to make it even remotely enjoyable. The most important thing to understand about Alliances is that this was the set that told players that the trend of having new expansions that were consistently weaker than those preceding them was over. The Dark was considerably weaker than many of the cards in Legends. Fallen Empires had very few tournament staples. Homelands had even fewer than that. Ice Age had a few, but when you have a set with 380 cards, yeah, you're going to have a few tournament staples, but a lot of the most powerful tournament staples were reprints. With Alliances, tournament staples were going to come in the future instead of coming out in dribs and drabs. Alliances took the direction of decline of Magic and turned it around. The following set, Mirage, helped make limited and established elements of limited play and a fun format, thus setting up the real solidification of the Pro Tour and the base for Magic to really take off as something to be excited for in the future. But Alliances was the rejuvenation of Magic. Alliances was the turning point. Okay, so with all that said, all that historical context, how does Alliances stack up against other sets? Well, I'm giving Alliances a 6 out of 10. Good, but not great. There's still a lot of cards that fail to excite, and there's no really cohesive theme to the set. Force of Will may be one of the most important spells in the game's history, but one super important spell doesn't bump up the verdict itself. And as I mentioned, Alliances wasn't a viable set for Limited, but it was the most important set for Magic since ABU to that date, and it's left a huge imprint on the game as a whole. I would not be here making this show if not for Alliances. So let's give the set due diligence. Yeah, it's been a while between this show and the previous one, so I really want to say thank you guys for watching and staying in communication and keeping in touch. You know, I've been going through a couple difficult things in my life. I've had some health issues, some mental health issues, and life has been pretty stressful living abroad, and it's been tough for me to put together the show, but I really do enjoy doing it. And if you enjoy this show, like, subscribe, and share, and tell your friends about it. Next time on Ancestral Recall, we're delving into another set that radically transformed Magic forever that many of my viewers have requested, Urza's Saga. How does Saga fare under the magnifying glass? Well, stay tuned. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games and good luck.